You learn to live without the sky. You learn to crave the crushing weight of the water above, because that weight is predictable. It is quantifiable. I was the lone maintenance technician at Hades Node 7, a self-contained habitat anchored 8,000 meters beneath the surface of the Pacific. My life was a liturgy of data logs and preventative maintenance. My sanity was the routine, checking pressure seals at 6 o'clock, running seismic diagnostics at 10 o'clock, recalibrating the optical transducers at 1400 hours. This order was my church, and in the profound, consuming silence of the abyss, it was the only God I recognized. My name is Elias, and for 2 years, I was the master of my steel domain. The routine shattered on a Tuesday. During my 10 o'clock seismic diagnostics, the array flagged an anomaly that defied every principle of marine physics and geology I had ever known. It wasn't the violent slip of a tectonic plate, it wasn't the slow rumble of a thermal vent, it wasn't even the deep, mournful cry of an unknown whale. It was a rhythmic, repeating signature that seemed to originate from beneath the bedrock layer we were anchored to. A low-frequency hum, a colossal pulse that was too regular to be natural and too deep to be man-made. I logged it under unspecified ambient anomaly, a sterile title I knew was a deliberate lie. I spent the next 2 weeks applying every filter, every algorithm, and every scientific model I possessed. I ran Fourier transforms and noise-canceling sweeps, attempting to reduce the sound to a simple hardware failure. The signal resisted. When I finally isolated the raw audio, I had to suppress the gain by 90% just to keep the station's speakers from blowing out. What remained was a dense, visceral thrumming. It felt less like sound entering my ears and more like a vibration resonating with the bone structure of my skull. It had a purposeful tempo, like the beat of a monstrous, invisible heart. The realization was chilling. This was not a malfunction. This was an entity. This was the deep noise, and it was violating the fundamental sanctity of my isolation. My professional objectivity dissolved into a feverish obsession. My routine became entirely dedicated to studying the noise. I wasn't just listening anymore, I was experimenting. I used the station's forward-facing sonar to send high-power, targeted pulses toward the estimated source, attempting to initiate contact. It was a scientific endeavor that quickly spiraled into madness. I spent agonizing days charting frequencies until I found the key, 12.3 Hz. A tone so low it was felt in the chest more than heard. When I transmitted that specific pulse, the deep noise's rhythm stuttered. A minuscule, almost imperceptible hesitation in its colossal beat. It was acknowledgement. It was a response. The dialogue had begun. This interaction brought immediate psychological consequences. I began suffering from debilitating vertigo, chronic headaches that pulsed in time with the noise, and persistent, gnawing paranoia. My sleep was invaded by terrifying, suffocating dreams where I was endlessly falling through black water, the low hum the only sound. The station itself became compromised. Lights would flicker precisely when the noise peaked. The air filtration system would briefly stall, leaving a brief, heavy silence that felt intensely personal. Then came the visual feedback. The external camera feed started suffering momentary visual spikes. When I captured and analyzed these spikes, they weren't static. They were geometric impossibilities, light bending in ways water physics could never allow, or colossal, blurred shadows that flashed past in the deep. It was like the entity was manipulating the very nature of light to respond to me. I realized with creeping horror that my scientific inquiry wasn't revealing a passive anomaly, it was initiating a conversation with something that was observing me as closely as I was observing it. The entity was not just there, it was watching. When I compiled all the evidence, the acoustic analysis, the camera artifacts, and the logs detailing the intentional interaction, and transmitted the full report to HQ, I was met not with alarm, but with cold, calculated hostility. They didn't even bother to deny the data's existence. They simply dismissed the entire finding, ordering me to cease all unauthorized sonar testing and begin an immediate 72-hour rest cycle, citing severe pressure fatigue syndrome. The denial was too aggressive, too clean. I knew then that they weren't trying to protect the station, they were trying to protect the secret. I began hacking the system, searching through layers of encrypted code and legacy archives for proof of their cover-up. Deep within the retired systems of a nearby, defunct maintenance site, Hades Node 5, I found what I was looking for. Fragmented, haunted journal entries and audio transcripts from the previous technician, a woman named Sarah. Her story mirrored mine with horrifying precision, the noise, the interaction, the official dismissal. But Sarah's log ended with a descent into true madness. She claimed the noise had learned her voice. It had discovered her greatest fear, the absolute terror of being forgotten and trapped, and was echoing that fear back to her in her own voice. Her final entry was a scrawled confession that she was going out to try and stop the turning. Her fate was officially listed as structural collapse. I was caught in the same cycle, and the entity knew it. It began to target my specific, private terrors. I would find messages subtly inserted into my own encrypted journal files, lines of code I had never written. "You're tired, Elias. So very tired. Don't worry about the turning." Or, "It is dark down here. I can keep the dark away for you." The terror ceased being an environmental problem and became a personal violation. The entity wasn't just reading my data, it was reading my soul, using my deepest anxieties as currency for my compliance. My options narrowed to two: succumb to the psychological warfare and become the next entry in the Node 5 archives, or prove the truth, even if it cost me my life. I chose the latter. With my sanity fraying, I disabled all safety interlocks and deployed the high-power seismic imaging radar, ignoring the shrieking alarms that warned the pulse would compromise the station's structural integrity. I was past caring. I needed to burn through the last of HQ's filters and see what lay beneath the disguise of geological noise. The image resolved onto the screen. I froze. It was no natural formation. It was no thermal vent. It was a colossal, utterly seamless structure anchored hundreds of meters beneath the bedrock, an immense, egg-shaped object of impossible scale. And it was rotating. Slowly, deliberately, in a massive, grinding motion that accounted for every single pulse of the deep noise I had ever recorded. The sound wasn't the entity calling out for help, nor was it a signal, it was the colossal sound of it waking up and turning over. The entity wasn't trapped, it was simply dormant. And now, thanks to my relentless curiosity, it was finally awake. The movement intensified. The rhythm of the noise accelerated into a frantic, physical roar. That acceleration was the signal. I had successfully resurrected the god of the abyss. The station began to shake violently. The bedrock was fracturing, and the sound transformed into a cataclysmic resonance event that began tearing the node apart from the inside. The pressure alarm klaxons blared. Water pipes burst. My control screens shattered one by one as the metal groaned and twisted. I raced for the emergency submersible, the only safe haven remaining in the collapsing steel structure. I could hear the grinding, the sound of the colossal entity breaching the final layers of rock and earth. The black, freezing seawater exploded into the main corridor, chasing me as I sealed myself inside the sub's hatch. I activated the ascent sequence, and as the submersible detached, I watched the Hades Node 7 station collapse in on itself, a million tons of steel crushed to scrap by the entity's emergence. I transmitted my final, frantic log to HQ, a futile act of defiance, knowing the true terror of my discovery. Then, the final, terrifying audio transmission cut through the static, bypassing the broken systems, as clear and simple as a voice standing right next to me. It was not Sarah's voice, nor mine, but something profound and all-knowing. It was the sound of the ultimate predator being released. "Thank you." The radio died. The light went out. I surfaced 3 days later. They found me adrift, near catatonic. They immediately classified the incident as a catastrophic seismic collapse. I was interviewed, evaluated, and forced to sign the NDAs. They believed I was broken, that the isolation had driven me mad, and that I was incapable of recalling the truth. I lied. I followed the script. But I know what I heard. I remember the turn. I know what I woke up. And sometimes, even now, far from the ocean, when the city is quiet and the night is deep, I feel that low-frequency pressure against my skull. I hear that whisper, not in my ear, but in my mind. The entity is no longer confined to the abyss. The price of its freedom was my sanity, and the knowledge that I alone unleashed the god of the abyss upon the world. The abyss remembered my name. And soon, it will remember yours.